In 1863, a Union soldier sat by a campfire in Tennessee, broke open his ration of the day, and started counting. He was not counting money, and he was not counting bullets. He was counting worms. By his own account, he found 32 of them wriggling inside a single cracker. He was not the only one. Soldiers across both armies wrote home describing coffee cups with a greasy film of drowned weevils floating on top, skimmed off before drinking, no different than picking a fly out of a drink at a summer picnic. Roughly 3 million men fought in the American Civil War, and on any given day, a large share of them were chewing, soaking, or cursing the exact same object. It went by many names: tooth dullers, sheet iron crackers, molar breakers, worm castles, but officially it had one name: hardtack. A soldier's standard ration was around 10 to 12 pieces of it a day, distributed by the crate, baked by the thousands in northern factories, and shipped by wagon and rail to men who, by the time it reached them, would sooner throw it than eat it. And here is the detail that makes this strange. Some of the hardtack handed out during the Civil War had been baked 15 years earlier, during the Mexican-American War, and it was still, technically, edible. Not appetizing, not soft, but edible. Think about that for a second. This was a food so aggressively engineered to resist time that a cracker could outlive the war it was made for, then outlive the next war too, and still get shipped out to hungry men who needed calories more than they needed comfort. It was not gold. It was not silver. It was flour, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt. And it built and broke armies for roughly 3,000 years. Today, you could bake a version of it in your own kitchen with $3 of ingredients from a grocery store. So, how did a cracker with almost no ingredients, no flavor, and no mercy for human teeth become one of the most important pieces of military technology in the history of warfare? How did it feed legions, fleets, colonizers, and revolutionaries across 3 continents and still end up as an internet joke and a museum curiosity? That was 1863. But the story of hardtack does not start in a Civil War mess tent. It starts almost 2,000 years earlier in the marching camps of the Roman legions. Wheat itself had already been domesticated for thousands of years by the time any Roman baker turned it into Buccellatum, first cultivated by early farming communities in the Fertile Crescent roughly 10,000 years ago, who selected and replanted the grains that clung hardest to the stalk instead of scattering to the wind, generation after generation, without any concept of genetics, without any written science, simply by watching which plants fed them best and saving those seeds. They did not know the word domestication. They were doing it anyway. That patient, accidental engineering is the reason flour existed at all by the time Rome needed a biscuit that could survive a military campaign. And it is worth remembering that every hard, humble ration in this story is standing on top of thousands of years of quiet agricultural trial and error that nobody wrote down at the time. The Roman army needed something Rome's enemies rarely had, which was the ability to keep an army fed for months at a time, far from home, without the food rotting in the packs of the men carrying it. The Romans called their version Buccellatum, a hard biscuit made from flour, salt, and water, baked twice at a low temperature to drive out every trace of moisture. No moisture meant no mold, no bacteria, and in a dry storage sack, functionally, no expiration date. Roman law codes from the later empire, including the Codex Theodosianus, specified exactly what a soldier on campaign should carry: hardtack and bread, wine and vinegar, bacon and mutton, rationed out so that the hardtack and vinegar covered 2 days of marching before the softer food arrived. The relationship between the biscuit and the soldier ran so deep that certain elite Roman troops eventually became known as Bucellari, which translates roughly to biscuit eaters. Not a nickname born out of affection. A nickname born out of survival. Losing a tooth to a bite of Buccellatum was considered such a routine hazard of service that soldiers apparently joked about it the way modern soldiers might joke about blisters. Consider the scale involved. A single Roman legion at full strength numbered around 5,000 men, and the empire, at its height, fielded roughly 30 legions simultaneously, spread from Britain to the borders of Persia. Feeding a force that size on the move required grain logistics on a scale the ancient world had rarely attempted before Rome perfected it. Granaries positioned along military roads, bakeries built into permanent forts, and a supply system so dependable that a legion could, in theory, march for weeks without ever depending on local farmland for its bread. Buccellatum was not a footnote in that system. It was the load-bearing wall. Even the word itself carries a small piece of this history. Biscuit comes from the Latin phrase Bis-Coctus, meaning twice baked, a description that was not a marketing flourish, but a literal manufacturing instruction, because baking a piece of dough only once was never enough to guarantee it would survive a long voyage. Hardtack, the English name that eventually stuck centuries later, is simpler and blunter, a straightforward combination of the word hard and an old sailor's slang term tack, which once just meant food, and in some regional dialects specifically meant bad food. Sailors were not being poetic when they named it. They were being accurate. This is where the story could easily stop being interesting, because on the surface, it is just a cracker. But look closer at what that cracker actually solved. Before hardtack and its ancestors, an army's range was limited by how long its fresh bread would last, which in a humid climate was days, sometimes hours. A biscuit that could survive a Mediterranean summer without spoiling meant a legion could march farther, wait longer, and besiege a city without starving first. The Romans were not the only ancient people who figured this out. Egyptian sailors provisioned their ships with a similar hard bread called dura cake, baked to survive the punishing dryness and heat of Nile and Red Sea voyages centuries before Rome existed as more than a village of huts. Different rivers, different empires, same basic engineering problem, and remarkably, the same basic solution. Strip out the water, and time stops mattering. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because hardtack does not disappear along with the Roman legions. It resurfaces, almost unchanged, wherever the same problem shows up again. An army or a fleet that needs to eat for months without access to fresh food. Records describe King Richard I, known as Richard the Lionheart, setting sail from England toward the Third Crusade in 1190, his ships loaded with what English sources called biscuit of muslin, a coarse mixed-grain hard bread made from barley, rye, and bean flour. Whether every detail of the supply records from that campaign survives intact is debated among historians, but the pattern is not in dispute. Wherever medieval or early modern powers needed to move soldiers or sailors across water or land for extended periods, a hard biscuit made from grain and water kept reappearing under a new name in a new language. By the time of the Spanish Armada in 1588, England's naval forces had a theoretical daily allowance of 1 pound of ship's biscuit per sailor, alongside a full gallon of small beer, which sounds less like a ration and more like a dare. That ratio of biscuit to beer was not a joke, though. Beer was safer to drink than most available water at sea, and the biscuit was there to provide bulk calories that would not rot in a wooden barrel over a 4-month or 8-month voyage. And here is the uncomfortable reality that no navy of the era could avoid. The quality of that biscuit depended entirely on the honesty of the miller who ground the flour. Unscrupulous contractors regularly stretched their flour with gravel, sawdust, and whatever cheap filler happened to be lying around the mill floor, because a Navy contract paid the same whether the flour was pure or padded. Sailors bit down expecting bread, and sometimes found grit instead. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains a lot about how governments eventually took control of biscuit production themselves, rather than trusting private bakers with a soldier's or sailor's next meal. That takeover happened most dramatically in England. The English Channel Squadron in 1805 carried 4 months of biscuit supply for its home waters patrols, while ships bound for the East Indies were stocked with as much as 8 months of hardtack, meant to survive tropical humidity on one end of the voyage and cold, damp Atlantic conditions on the other. To meet that demand at a national scale, the Royal Navy built dedicated victualling yards at Plymouth, Deptford, Portsmouth, and Malta. Essentially industrial bakeries built for one purpose: turning out biscuit by the ton on a schedule to a fixed standard. This was not about seasoning food or feeding a crew a nice meal. This was strategic infrastructure, no different in function from a modern military supply depot, except that instead of ammunition, the product coming off the line was bread that never went soft. The reformer credited with formalizing this whole system is Samuel Pepys, better remembered today as a diarist, who in the 1660s worked out the first comprehensive table of Royal Navy rations, specifying that every sailor receive, in his words, 1 pound daily of good, clean, sweet, sound, well-baked and well-conditioned wheaten biscuit. Mass production of hardtack for the Royal Navy is documented as early as the 1660s, and by 1731, the 1 pound daily biscuit ration was written directly into naval regulations. This was not about giving sailors something to snack on. It was quite literally calories that could survive a war. By the time of Queen Victoria's reign in the mid-1800s, the Royal Navy had mechanized the entire process at the Royal Clarence Victualling Yard in Gosport. Dough was mixed and rolled into sheets roughly 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, then stamped by machine into around 60 hexagonal biscuits at a time, a shape chosen deliberately because hexagons pack together with almost no wasted space, unlike round biscuits which leave gaps. Each biscuit carried the royal seal and a code identifying the exact oven that baked it, essentially a supply chain audit trail baked directly into a cracker, centuries before anyone used the phrase supply chain. If you ordered that version of a biscuit at a bakery today, you would probably need a hammer before you needed a knife, and that toughness was not a manufacturing flaw, it was the entire point, and it is worth pausing on why. In a world without refrigeration, without vacuum sealing, without any chemical preservatives beyond salt itself, moisture was the enemy of every food a military tried to stockpile. Fresh bread grows mold within days. Meat rots within hours in warm climates. But a biscuit baked and rebaked, sometimes 4 separate times for long ocean voyages until every trace of internal moisture was gone, could sit in a barrel for months, occasionally for years, and remain something a starving person could still choke down and survive on. This was not a luxury food. This was the difference between an army that could campaign for a season and an army that had to turn back home in 6 weeks. This was the difference between a naval blockade that could hold a coastline for a year and one that collapsed from hunger in a month. Now, historians debate whether every romantic story about ancient or medieval biscuit-eating soldiers is completely accurate, since supply records from those eras are often incomplete or written generations after the fact. But the underlying pattern across 3,000 years of military history is not in dispute at all. Whoever solved the food storage problem first tended to win the longer war. But solving the storage problem created a new problem entirely. And this is where the story of hardtack turns genuinely dark. A food that never spoils is not automatically a food that keeps a person alive and healthy. Hardtack is almost pure starch. It has essentially no vitamin C, no significant protein beyond what is naturally present in wheat, and none of the fresh produce that human bodies require to prevent disease over long stretches of time. For centuries, sailors living for months at sea on a diet built around biscuit, salted meat, and beer suffered and died from scurvy in horrifying numbers, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that rots the gums, reopens old wounds, and eventually kills. During the 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 1760s, more than half of Britain's naval personnel are estimated to have died, not from combat, but from malnutrition and disease brought on by exactly this kind of long voyage diet. Half. Not half the casualties, half of the men who served. Hardtack did not cause scurvy on its own, but it was the calorie backbone of a ration system that had no answer for what the human body actually needed to survive months without land. And this is the part that should make you angry. A naval surgeon named James Lind ran one of history's first controlled clinical trials in 1747, dividing scurvy-stricken sailors aboard a Royal Navy ship into groups and testing different remedies, and found that citrus fruit cured the disease far faster than any other treatment tried. The connection between fresh produce and the prevention of scurvy was, from that point on, documented and reasonably well understood, and it still took British naval bureaucracy roughly 4 more decades to fully implement the fix at scale. Men kept dying of a preventable disease while the fix sat, essentially known, waiting for institutions to act on it. Even once the disease question was better understood, the biscuit itself remained an object of dread rather than comfort for the ordinary soldier or sailor forced to live on it. During the American Civil War, the gap between when hardtack was baked and when it reached the front lines could stretch into weeks or months. And by the time it arrived, the biscuit had often hardened into something men compared to sheet iron, and had frequently been colonized by insects along the way. Weevils laid eggs in stored flour, and their larvae hatched directly inside the barrels and crates of finished biscuit, so that a piece of hardtack could look completely normal on the outside, while its interior was riddled with tiny bored holes and living insects. Soldiers developed an entire etiquette around this. Some broke their hardtack into their coffee and let the heat drive the insects to the surface, where they could be skimmed off, described in soldier accounts almost casually, no different than skimming foam off a drink. Others waited for darkness, then broke the biscuit apart by candlelight and picked the insects out one by one before eating what remained. Some simply ate the hardtack as it was, worms included, reasoning that the extra protein was not going to hurt them, and given the alternative was often outright starvation, they were probably right. Confederate soldiers whose supply lines collapsed far more often than the Union's reportedly celebrated when they managed to capture Union hardtack stores during raids, Weevils and all, because any calories were better than none. Soldiers found other ways to make the biscuit tolerable, and some of those methods became small culinary traditions in their own right. Crumbling hardtack into hot bacon grease alongside salt pork produced a rough skillet meal soldiers called Skillygalee, while breaking it apart and boiling it into a stew with salted meat produced something else entirely, known as Lobscouse, a dish whose name and basic concept had already been floating around sailors' galleys for more than a century by that point. Not every hardtack story from the war was purely grim. One soldier's memoir recounts a well-worn camp joke about a man from Kansas who bit into his ration and found something unusually soft buried inside, which turned out, on inspection, to be a 10-penny nail baked directly into the biscuit, presumably by accident, presumably in some distant northern factory that never checked its dough closely enough. Soldiers told and retold that story for exactly the reason people still tell absurd stories about bad food today. Because laughing at the object that was slowly ruining your teeth felt better than simply enduring it in silence. Union soldiers wrote and sang an entire wartime song about the object that was keeping them alive and making them miserable in equal measure. A tune that ran, in part, describing the wail heard in camp both night and day as men murmured about hard crackers alongside their snoring, calling out for it to never come again. This was not about seasoning food or making a meal more interesting. This was about survival, wrapped inside a joke. Because laughing at the thing that was slowly wearing down your teeth and your morale was sometimes the only defense a soldier had left. If you are finding this interesting so far, go ahead and hit subscribe now. This channel covers stories exactly like this every week, tracing the hidden histories behind the objects and substances that quietly decided the outcome of wars, empires, and entire economies. And you will not want to miss what is coming later in this one, because the story of hardtack is about to collide with one of the strangest food inventions in human history. Because while soldiers in North America were composing folk songs about worm-infested crackers, a parallel revolution had already begun on the other side of the Atlantic that would eventually make hardtack far less necessary, even if it never fully replaced it. In 1795, Napoleon Bonaparte's revolutionary French government, desperate to solve the exact same problem that had haunted militaries since the Roman legions, offered a cash prize of 12,000 francs, worth roughly $300,000 in modern terms, to anyone who could invent a reliable way to preserve large quantities of food for troops on long campaigns. Napoleon is widely credited with the observation that an army marches on its stomach, and whether he said those exact words or not, the sentiment drove French military policy directly. The prize sat unclaimed for 14 years. Then, in 1809, a French confectioner and chef named Nicolas Appert, who had no scientific training and no real understanding of why his method worked, claimed it. Appert's technique involves sealing food inside glass jars, corking them, and boiling the sealed jars in water for an extended period. He believed, incorrectly, that keeping air away from the food was what preserved it. He had no idea that microorganisms were the actual cause of spoilage, a fact that would not be proven until Louis Pasteur's work decades later. Here is the twist. Appert did not need to understand the science to make the method work. He tested it by sending 18 different sealed foods, including partridge, vegetables, and gravy, out to sea with French troops for a voyage of a little over 4 months, and every single item came back unspoiled. Napoleon awarded him the prize personally in 1810. That same year, an Englishman named Peter Durand patented a tin-coated iron canister as an alternative to fragile glass jars, and the modern tin can was born, though it took another 30 years for anyone to bother inventing the can opener, which meant early tinned rations were sometimes opened with a bayonet or a chisel. Canned preserved beef became an official part of Royal Navy rations by 1847, and over the following decades, canning slowly began chipping away at hardtack's monopoly on long-lasting military food. But hardtack did not disappear, because canning was expensive, heavy, and still relatively fragile compared to a biscuit that could simply be dropped, stacked, soaked in rain, and still eaten. Instead, hardtack industrialized right alongside canning. In 1801, a baker named Josiah Bent began a commercial baking operation in Milton, Massachusetts, producing what he called water crackers, made from nothing but flour and water, engineered specifically to survive long sea voyages departing from the port of Boston. His biscuits were later carried by gold prospectors heading to California in the Great Migration of 1849, packed into wagon trains for a journey that could take months across terrain with no reliable food source. And here is the part that does not get enough credit. Bent's company went on to supply the original hardtack crackers issued to Union troops during the American Civil War, meaning the exact biscuit soldiers were singing bitter folk songs about in muddy Tennessee camps had in some cases come off the same production line as the crackers carried by prospectors chasing gold in California. Northern factories during the Civil War baked thousands of these crackers daily, packed them into wooden crates, and shipped them out by wagon and rail, an entire industrial supply chain built around a food product that had barely changed in recipe since the Roman legions. This was the pattern of industrialization across nearly every major food of this era. Mechanize the process, standardize the shape, scale up production until a once scarce survival food became something a government could manufacture by the ton, cheaply enough to hand out by the millions of pieces without a second thought about cost. By the turn of the 20th century, hardtack had become such an established piece of military identity that it started showing up in unexpected places, including as propaganda. During the Spanish-American War in 1898, following the sinking of the American battleship USS Maine, some military hardtack was stamped with the slogan, "Remember the Maine," turning a plain flour biscuit into a piece of wartime messaging that soldiers would literally consume. Australian and New Zealand troops in the 20th century gave their own hardtack rations a sardonic nickname, calling them Anzac wafers, a dry joke aimed at a food nobody particularly wanted to eat, but that everyone needed anyway. This is a food that traveled through the Roman legions, the Crusades, the Age of Sail, and the American Civil War essentially unchanged, and it very nearly made it through the 20th century the same way. Before the corned beef and apricot jam handed to soldiers on the Western Front during the First World War, and before the tinned sea rations of the Second World War, hardtack was, for thousands of years, simply what a soldier or sailor could count on receiving. German troops in the 20th century had their own blunt nickname for the biscuit, calling it Panzerplatten, which translates roughly to armor plates, a joke about density rather than protection. but a joke that still made the same point every other army across every other century had already made in its own language. It was only in the years around the First World War that industrialized nations finally had the canning capacity, the refrigerated transport, and the logistical infrastructure to phase hardtack out as a frontline staple and replace it with something a soldier might actually enjoy eating. 3,000 years of continuous use, and it took powered transport, mechanized canning, and global rail networks to finally push it toward retirement. Flour, water, sometimes salt. No refining, no processing beyond baking and rebaking, no secret ingredient. It worked because it was simple, and it stayed in use for 3,000 years precisely because nobody could invent anything simpler that also worked as well. Which brings the story to today. And here is where the irony becomes almost impossible to ignore. Hardtack, in its purest historical form, never really became a global food commodity the way sugar or tea or the potato eventually did. It never conquered dinner tables or built colonial fortunes the way those other commodities did. Instead, it mostly retreated into a handful of very specific niches, and the modern uses of it tend to catch people off guard, because a food once associated with broken teeth and worm-eaten misery is now, in a strange twist, treated as a nostalgic comfort item. In Alaska, a direct descendant of Royal Navy hardtack called pilot bread arrived with sailing ships in the 1880s and never really left. It became and remains today one of the most beloved and commercially significant crackers in the state, sold in supermarkets, stockpiled by rural households for winter, and treated by many Alaskans the way other Americans might treat a favorite regional snack food, something between a pantry staple and a point of local pride. The G.H. Bent Company, the direct descendant of Josiah Bent's original 1801 bakery, continued producing and selling authentic Civil War-style hardtack to reenactors and history enthusiasts for more than 2 centuries, only closing its doors in 2018. Hardtack in a near-identical form is still eaten today in Papua New Guinea, where it remains part of everyday food culture rather than a historical curiosity. And modern survivalists, emergency preparedness planners, and long-distance backpackers still occasionally turn back to the exact same recipe the Romans used: flour, water, and thyme in a low oven. Because in a world full of vacuum-sealed, freeze-dried meals and shelf-stable protein bars, a food with functionally no expiration date, requiring no refrigeration, no electricity, and no complicated packaging, is still, in the right circumstances, hard to beat. And here is a curveball most people never see coming, because hardtack's most enormous production run in American history did not happen during the Civil War at all. It happened during the Cold War. Starting in the early 1960s, at the height of American fear over nuclear attack, the federal government commissioned the mass production of something called the Civil Defense All-Purpose Survival Biscuit, a cracker made almost entirely from wheat flour and other cheap shelf-stable ingredients, engineered to be stockpiled by the ton inside fallout shelters across the country. Roughly 165,000 tons of these biscuits were baked and distributed into about 100,000 shelters nationwide, each shelter stocked with enough crackers to provide roughly 10,000 calories per person, meant to sustain survivors of a nuclear strike for a 2-week shelter stay, while the outside world, theoretically, became safe again. By some estimates, the total production run reached roughly 20 billion individual biscuits, an almost incomprehensible number for a cracker most Americans alive today have never heard of. This was not medieval biscuit or Civil War hardtack in name, but in function and in basic recipe, it was the exact same idea Roman legionaries had relied on 2,000 years earlier. Flour, baked hard, stored dry, ready to outlast a catastrophe. Nobody ever needed to eat their way through a nuclear war, thankfully, and by the mid-1970s, laboratory testing found that most of the stockpiled biscuits had gone rancid sitting in their tins, leading the federal government to quietly abandon the program and let local communities dispose of, or in some cases repurpose, millions of pounds of unused Cold War hardtack. Basements and old fallout shelters across the country are still occasionally found today with sealed tins of these biscuits sitting untouched since the Kennedy administration. A bizarre little time capsule connecting the exact same military engineering problem that occupied Rome, Britain, and the Union Army all the way into the atomic age. Here is the genuinely startling fact most people never hear. Properly baked and stored hardtack, kept dry, does not really expire in any meaningful sense at all. There are documented examples of hardtack biscuits from the 1800s, more than a century and a half old, that survive today in museum collections, still recognizably intact as the exact objects soldiers once complained about, essentially fossilized bread that time simply could not touch. So think about the full arc of this thing. It was there when Roman legionaries called themselves biscuit eaters and marched across a continent on flour and water. It was there when Crusaders loaded their ships bound for the Holy Land. It was there when the Spanish Armada sailed against England. And it was there when England's own sailors were dying of scurvy by the hundreds, despite having full bellies of it. It was there in the wooden crates shipped to Civil War soldiers who wrote folk songs cursing its name while eating it anyway, because the alternative was starving. It was there when canning was invented specifically to try to replace it, and it refused to be replaced. It was there in the propaganda stamped onto a cracker after the sinking of a battleship. It was there, quietly, in basements and church halls across an entire nation bracing for nuclear war, stacked by the ton in metal tins nobody ever hoped to open. And it is there today, sitting quietly on a supermarket shelf in Alaska, purchased for a couple of dollars by someone who has probably never heard the word Buccellatum in their life. A food this plain should not have had this much influence on human history. No spice, no rarity, no exotic origin story, nothing anyone ever fought a war specifically over. Just flour, water, and the simple, stubborn fact that it refused to rot, in a world where almost everything else eventually did. Not bad for a cracker that most people alive today would spit out after the very first bite. If any part of this surprised you, let me know in the comments which detail stuck with you the most, whether it was the Roman soldiers nicknamed after their own rations, the sailors who lost half a navy to scurvy while their ships were full of food, or the fact that a Civil War cracker could sit in a barrel for 15 years and still technically be dinner. Do me a favor and hit subscribe if you have not already, because there are a lot more stories like this one coming. Ordinary objects hiding extraordinary history in plain sight. And I will see you in the next one.